Women's liberation was a bad thing is something that you would almost never hear. In fact, if you said that in front of a group of women, they would probably become pretty angry with you. But I challenge you to ask yourself this question. Did the women's liberation movement actually liberate women? Are women really any better off today than they were back then? Well, let's look at how women were before women's liberation. Obviously, women were encouraged to get married and have children. They would date different men. They would get to choose who to marry, although obviously they might be in competition with other women who are also looking to get married. After the women would get married, their husband would be the one who would work and take care of them. They would be responsible for taking care of the children and also handling other household duties. That might include spending the money that the husband made. The cultural norm was that women would control most of the consumer spending, which is a cultural norm that exists to this day, despite all other cultural norms surrounding marriage having been destroyed by liberalism. Now, obviously, there were certain situations where this did not always work out well for women. For example, if a woman married an abusive or irresponsible man, they might be stuck in this sort of abusive marriage that was hard to get out of, since culturally it was seen as taboo to get divorced. But on the other hand, abusing your wife or being irresponsible was also a cultural taboo. So women, through their relationship with family members and fellow church members, etc., did have ways they could assert their own cultural pressure onto men to do a better job, although I'm sure this was not always 100% effective. There were also some women who would get married and then their husband would be killed or would die for some reason, and then the woman would have to go to work to support herself and her children. And our society allowed women to do that, but there were certain jobs that they weren't allowed to get. They weren't allowed to advance in certain careers, even though they had the qualifications and otherwise should have been qualified to advance. So there were some aspects that didn't always work well in the traditional system for women. Let's look at what happened after women's liberation. Women, now that they are liberated, they no longer have to fulfill the traditional gender roles, and they're able to, and in fact encouraged to, go out and get their own job. So now both parents are working. So obviously this creates some problems that the household now has to solve. Needs to find some way for the children to be taken care of, so it adds an expense of daycare. Otherwise, the children might be given to some other family member who then has to watch the children. The children don't get raised as much by the parents, and the ability to learn moral or life lessons from the parents is reduced as a result of this. Given that both the husband and the wife are now working, there also isn't someone who is at the home necessarily dedicated to doing chores. That means that when the parents get home, they have to do chores. A lot of times this doesn't leave a whole lot of time to make dinner. Therefore, takeout and fast food becomes more of an attractive option in order to feed the family. And takeout and fast food obviously is unhealthy and can lead to health problems and can result in the family becoming obese. So these extra stresses are created, but one might say, well, at least with women's liberation, women now have the option to work, but they're not required to. But that's not necessarily true. When it becomes a norm that both the husband and the wife work, then the household income is expected to be double. That means that housing prices can reflect the standard that at least two people at the household are earning a salary. So basically what that means is that in order to afford a mortgage payment it soon becomes paramount that both the husband and the wife work, and that if one of them does not work, they won't be able to afford a mortgage payment. The other issue that happens is as women enter the workplace and compete with men, it also lowers the cost of labor, because now employers are not limited to just hiring men, they can hire women. That basically doubles the labor supply to an employer. Now, if you take any finite sort of object, like let's say the amount of gold that exists in the world, and you doubled it, then all of the gold that originally existed would become less valuable. And that's exactly what has happened to people's labor because of the liberation of women. Now, those are just some of the problems that were caused by women's liberation, but let's go to the central question. Have women, in fact, been liberated by all of this? We know that in the past, the women were basically able to pick who their husband was, and after that, they didn't have a whole lot of choice. They were expected to stay at home and raise children. Well, now that women have to compete in the marketplace, their life situation is complicated by the introduction of another person known as their boss. So women now have a boss. That boss can be a man or it can be a woman. But that boss has a lot of power over the woman. Arguably, the boss may even have more power than that woman's husband. And here's something that should be important to note. So unlike the situation where a woman gets to pick her husband, she does not get to pick her boss. Now, I talked earlier about there being an issue with women. Sometimes they pick a certain husband and they don't make a wise choice, and the husband ends up abusing them. The same thing is a pretty common practice that happens in the workplace. In fact, we recently had this huge social movement called the Me Too movement, which was a protest over people who were in boss sort of status sexually abusing females who worked for them. If the idea was that women's liberation would protect women from being preyed upon by potentially abusive men and be dependent on those men, then the liberation movement has been entirely unsuccessful, because all it's done is put women in situations where they're preyed upon by other men of whom they had no choice over having a relationship with at all. And just like it was taboo and difficult for women to get a divorce from a man who turned out to be abusive, it can be very difficult for a woman to just quit her job or end her career when she ends up with some boss who is a sexual harasser. Bosses can also control women in a lot of ways that aren't abusive. They can make them work a ton of hours, which would cause them to neglect important family duties. Alternatively, they could cut their hours, which might make it difficult for the household to make its mortgage payment or make a car payment. In a lot of ways, employers wield a lot of power over their employees, and if women are their employees, then the employers wield a lot of power over women. Now, I also talked about prior to women's liberation, women did have some ability to push back against their husbands if they were abusive or irresponsible. And they could do so because there were cultural expectations of how men were supposed to treat women. So if a woman complained at her church that she had been abused, then the congregation might take a stand against her husband and pressure him into reforming himself. That sort of cultural power was something that women had available to them. Again, may not have always been effective in every instance, but they at least have it. But as far as women and their boss, they don't necessarily have as strong of an ability to influence abusive behavior by the boss. There are laws that prevent sexual harassment, but a lot of times for women, there's going to be a struggle to prove those allegations, and they have to go through very legalistic sort of processes within their HR department, which are also further governed by the rules of liberalism. As far as women's liberation being some great thing that liberalism has brought us, I would argue the contrary. I would say that basically all women's liberation did is throw women into the bondage of whatever corporate employer that they ended up stuck with. Those women who now have careers have much less freedom, much less ability to shape their own life, and much less ability to influence and raise their children than they did prior to this whole women's liberation thing to begin with. So once again, this is just yet another way why liberalism, the ideology that basically an individual should be able to live their life however they want, irrespective of cultural barriers, is an entirely flawed ideology.